This is part 2, the last part of my studio interview with John Schuessler at Perth, Australia in 1983. At the time, John was project manager for NASA Space Shuttle flight operations with McDonnell Douglas at Houston. He was also the Deputy Director of MUFON. I waited 35 years to release this interview to protect John's career, himself, and his family.
On the shuttlecraft. Now, would you have chosen the power plant that they used to put it into orbit yourself?
At this point in time, I would.
Is there an alternate method that you would have chosen or would choose if you could get public support for it?
Oh, certainly.
What kind would you use?
I wouldn't pin it to a particular kind at this point, but I would go for, in classical terms, an anti-gravitic propulsion system.
You would go for anti-gravity propulsion? Oh. But don't you think we're a fair way away from getting there?
Sure. You said if I had public support and money.
In other words, do you think if NASA had, or McDonnell Douglas, anybody had the support money, that they could develop the anti-gravity drive?
I think so.
So in other words, it's not a mysterious thing, this anti-gravity now.
Well, I think it's a mysterious thing because it's not generally accepted in the scientific community, and it's again the old not invented here syndrome.
Do you have any ideas?
I think that stems movement into the future tremendously.
Well, the thing that we need now is we need a breakthrough in a new concept in propulsion. That when we talk about chemical propulsion, we've stretched it just about as far as we can. We've always thought that the major advances to mankind came out of war. But what we need is an anti-gravitational device or something like that. I look at the pyramids, for example, and I am not convinced that we did not, at that time, have some type of anti-gravitational device that assisted those people in putting those huge stones in place. I think it was possible then. I think it is possible in the future that we will come up with some technique that can allow us to lift enormous masses with very little force and an expenditure of very little energy.
Well, now, when we talked to Dr. Henry Pohl at NASA earlier this year about the propulsion systems, he said that they had been working on electric propulsion systems, ion drives, all low power stuff, for sustained drives.
Oh, ion drives, yes, but then that wouldn't handle a shuttle type craft at all. You got to be in orbit and out free from the launch environment.
But then he said something else rather strange about that he would like to think that they're going to have something that will make the hardware immune to gravity in the immediate future, something like anti-gravity. And this is why I was probing that area, because he seemed to be talking in a manner that suggested he already knew about research in that area.
Well, maybe he did, and maybe he just thinks that that's the correct way to go.
He said, we don't want to build any more rockets. He said that shuttle engine is 97% efficient thrust, and he said that's the top of the range. You're not going to get any better. He said, we're tired of brute force.
That's true.
Isn't it?
That's true. I mean, it is a very high performance rocket engine, extremely high performance. That's why there's been problems developing it, getting turbo pumps that would run the speed and dump the right amount of stuff through there in time. But it's the best you got in today's technology. And when you've got the best you've got, then that's all you can politically get support for. You're not going to take a swinger and run out there and look for anti-gravity.
Not as a government.
Not as a government. That's absolutely right.
Let's look at it this way. If you had a private company, a rather large complex as a government contractor, and you had access to government funds for developing tools for space, because it's classified, usually it would be classified, wouldn't it be possible to develop technology along the more exotic lines without making it a public issue? Spend off some of your money over that way.
Of course it would be possible to do that. I mean, I have no doubt of that. The only problem is, if you're doing that as a government, I mean, you're saying that a government must back the funding, even though it's being done in a private organization, Therefore, someone in government has to make the conscious decision that they want to go another direction, quote, whatever that other direction is. Then that same person or group must also then evaluate what they're spending on the conventional systems. And the money that's being spent on conventional systems in all countries that I can see right now indicates that if there is something going on, it's only a token effect. You know, when you're talking about an anti-gravity system, you're talking about in the realm of science fiction as far as many scientists and many space technologists are concerned. And at the same time, you probably find every one of them would think that's a thrilling thing to have, but none would put their name on the line to even try to get the funding to work it. And if a few did, they were squirreled away in a secret facility someplace. Comparing it to the size of a program such as the B-1 bomber program, for instance, and the billions of dollars it takes to do it, there's no comparison. You know, it's very difficult to do something of a major scale in a very closed environment, unless you can go somewhere else to do it.
I guess you could overcharge, charge excessive profits on the contracts to the government and use that money, because there's nothing that restricts a space research company from doing other research on their own, is there?
No, you can always spend on your own all you wish, but you'll find it's very difficult to charge excess profits these days. The accounting system that's been put into place for military programs is very restrictive, and it's very difficult to hide money. I'm not saying it can't be done. I think there's a lot more likelihood that a banking conglomerate might back something such as that more than a government might. Now, of course, the banking conglomerate may have power over some government while they're doing it. But I would be a lot more inclined to feel that a major segment of the private banking industry might back development of something that could give them a payoff downstream that only they would have the foresight of doing.
Excuse me, sorry. Just had to get a frog out there.
Military organizations are notorious for protecting their own status quo, and unfortunately that causes them to remain backwards at times.
In as early as 1955, newspaper articles were being written, like at the New York Herald Tribune, by Ansel E. Talbert, about the major U.S. aerospace corporations that were doing research into anti-gravity. Now, the articles are reproduced in my book, The Cosmic Conspiracy, in the first appendix, page 142 through 148, so you can see the named corporations. What happened after 1955 is unknown.
What about military weapons? You were going to discuss that with us a while ago.
Yeah, I have a philosophy on the future of war, and maybe it's because I am kind of a peace-loving guy. I've never worked in a military program. I'd like to state that at this point. I was in the Navy to begin with, but all of my industry days has been in the peaceful uses of space. Literally every year that I've worked in the space program since 1962 has been just that. And as a result, I look at war from a different standpoint, even though the corporation I work for builds many fighter planes and missiles and things of that nature. I've had very little work with them.
Didn't Australia just buy some planes?
Australia just bought F-18 fighter aircraft from the United States.
That's your company?
From McDonnell Douglas Corporation, which is a fine vehicle. For some reason, we're getting a lot of static about it back in the States, not selling them here, but the fact that we're buying them, and I haven't figured that one out yet. It's one of the most advanced planes around, and people are complaining because we're buying them.
What, the United States?
In the United States. That's a strange approach. It's almost like self-destruction or something. I can't even get off into that because I don't understand it myself. But what I was trying to get at was my view of future war technology. And from my background viewpoints, what I was trying to give you an idea of where my feelings come from. I have seen through the space program technology evolve on a yearly basis from it can't possibly be done to the next year saying, oh, that was easy, wasn't it? Now, what is it we can't do now? And then someone will say, well, we'd like to do this. That's impossible again. In another year or so, we've done it. And with that attitude, the can-do attitude, and the free reign of operating openly to develop a technology, I think we could develop an anti-gravitic system I am firmly convinced we can do it. I do not think it's impossible, and I think we'll get into that in a few minutes when we talk about the other guy's space vehicle, the UFOs. But keeping in the line of space war, for instance, I think that we're going to see sometime in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe by the year of 2000, that nations are going to say, I don't want the nuclear threat any longer. And I mean all nations, not just the United States and not just Australia, but I think Russia, China, and others will say the same thing. I think that'll be driven because there'll no longer be two superpowers. There will be a number of superpowers by then that have vast armadas of nuclear weapons. And if we let that go unbridled, the world won't survive. There is no profitable payoff for one nation to destroy others with nuclear weapons, because they're effectively destroying themselves too. They'll pollute the environment, the plants, the animals, and everything. So therefore, what do? You start off by saying, I object to having those weapons based here or based there or whatever. And where does that leave? That leaves space. Now, are you going to let 20 nations put nuclear weapons in space? Will the United Nations go along with that, for instance? You know, we have a treaty now that we won't put nuclear weapons into space. If you take them off the land masses, you're going to have to put them in the oceans.
But that doesn't limit, now it's just nuclear weapons. There are other weapons, these gas dynamic lasers and plasma.
Well, I kind of wanted to get to that. I'm building a scenario for you.
Okay.
And then this scenario is essentially that people won't want those things on their land masses because of the fear of accidents. You hear that so much now from nuclear power plants. And that's because we're going through a phase there, like a child goes through a phase in growing and developing. But if you move these weapons off the face of the earth and put them into space, you cannot do it indiscriminately. Therefore, what do? You have to protect in some manner to make sure that any given nation doesn't launch an attack on the other nations. How do you do that? You do that with a very super sensitive set of space observatories of some nature, satellites that will surveil the total surface of the earth, and at any given point in time know absolutely if an attack is imminent, if one is being launched. Knowing it then is not enough. You could say, oh my God, give warning, so-and-so has launched nuclear weapons, they're going to destroy this country. Well, that doesn't really help you. The next step you must have is some sort of an agreement, a multinational or a World Federation operated set of satellites that can do something about that threat. And to do something about it, you would want to do it out of the atmosphere more than likely, outside the atmosphere. When an intercontinental ballistic missile is launched, for instance, somewhere along its trajectory, you'd want to destroy it in place. And the best way to do that would be to develop Star Wars type weapons. And Star Wars type weapons would probably start off working with lasers and going on to the use of what is simply known as particle beams or high energy beams, either one of which could destroy a missile in flight. And if those were completely controlled and directed by a world level commission of some kind, then you would no longer have the threat of war, of nuclear holocaust. Now that's downstream a ways. First of all, we don't have the capability of the total surveillance. We don't have the space-based weapons in place, and we don't have a group that has considered that they should work together and ensure that we don't have war.
You say you don't have the space-based weapons in place, but we do have them in the back
Well, I mean,
room.
we know that lasers have been developed, not particularly as weaponry, but you know, anytime you develop a technology, you can extrapolate it to anything else. And the research that goes on in that field in all countries, I'm sure, is very, very big. You know, a lot of money is being spent.
Do you know how the plasma laser combination weapon would work theoretically?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion about that, say in the atmosphere, for instance. You'd bore a hole in the atmosphere first, and then you'd pulse a beam down it to get rid of the atmospheric attenuation effects. There are problems with that. And I frankly think it's not the way to go for Earth-based weaponry. I think that for space-based weaponry, it is the way to go. And but it requires a lot of responsibility on the part of the people operating it. And how then we get people to work together to do that is really the $1 million question. And we have to talk about a lot of things besides the technology itself to do that. We have to talk about the desire of the people to want to do it, the desire of the nations to want to work together. But we're being driven in that direction too, simply by population growth and by world economies and a lot of things. That no one piece of this mess is going to make anything happen. It's going to be the unified whole. And I have great hopes for it all. I think that technology can be used to eradicate the threat of war rather than making war more possible. But I think we're in a very critical stage. Right now, the threat of nuclear war is hanging over everyone's head constantly, and people rattling sabers and the like. But I personally don't think that I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, I'm not too sure it is either, John, but what appears obvious to a lot of us that study this over here is that we're being conditioned as a world, like the environmental problems, the pollution, the population, the war threat, is well in advance of the actual level that they say it is. In other words, we're ahead of the problem. But to get the people's attention, it seems as though we're being conditioned about the alarming danger levels, and they're not there yet. Would you think that's correct?
Well, I think that is correct. You always have people that want to demonstrate, so to say. You can find a demonstration somewhere in the United States every day of the week for some cause, whether it's saving whales or finding homes for animals or stopping the building of nuclear power plants. Or there are people that are always willing to protest and to make a lot of noise about various subject matter. Those people seldom have a way of fixing the problem. They're good at making noise, but they're not fixers. And their best service probably is making the fixers go to work.
But you see, I kind of get the impression in my mind that a lot of these protesters and stuff, I think they probably realize in the organizational level of that what they're doing is not going to be that effective as far as stopping the thing, but it's getting the public attention in the media from a grassroots level so that the public awareness of these coming problems is raised.
That's true.
About the only way you can do that, it would seem, is being
is by
exceptional.
protest. Yeah. That brings to mind another point, though, that we have the option now of knowing what's going on in the total world almost instantaneously due to the fantastic media coverage we have now through the satellites, essentially communication satellites. And for that reason, attention focuses all over the world on a hotspot or a problem area or a changeover in government, the Russian changeover recently with Andropov that came into power. There's so much speculation on a daily basis of how that person is going to affect world relations and how people will react to that person. And every time there's a major election in the United States, and like you're getting ready to have one in Australia, those things are big drivers of change, change the whole style of government, the whole style of governmental operation, what the interest levels are. And surrounding that whole thing is a very large public relations effort, always to slant people in the direction of the leadership, the people in power, the people that are wanting to be in power. And that is a conditioning, definitely. You're being conditioned every day for something. And why not some of these other things? I like the speculation, though, that I think you were leaning toward. The conditioning caused by things like the movies of Close Encounters and E.T. That is an interesting concept that is conditioning us for something much bigger than our own personal conflicts here on Earth. And I think that there really may be something to that.
You mean you think Spielberg is really a public relations man for the ETs?
Yes, not particularly for a government, but if you look into Spielberg's background, he's had a since a boy. He's had an interest in a burning drive, apparently, to publicize this aspect of the movie world. Some people say far out type things, but if you look at the way he puts it together, it's all very logical. And it deals in the human emotion side of things. He knows exactly how to structure a child's conversation so that it can be a tearjerker, or it can paint a picture of the adult as being the bad guy because he doesn't really understand what a simple child can understand, in the big picture. And he's right. When you deal in UFO investigations, you find that quite often the child has the best concept of what's going on because he's not biased already and hasn't closed the doors on so many ideas and concepts. And I think that could lead us into a little bit of discussion of is there another technology out there? Is it extraterrestrial or terrestrial?
Well, do
be
you...
ready to go that way.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think? Are we being visited by non-human intelligences on this planet?
I think that the evidence indicates that we really are.
How long would you say that's been going on?
I would like to go back to about 1897 as a starting place. And I
not-
say
not-
1897 simply because, again, I'm interested in technology, and the first measurable evidence that I have came out in 1897. I have sociological research type evidence from various religious books and history books and the like that had started much before that. But in 1897 there was a report of a UFO crash at that time called an airship. But people called them airships then, for want of a better term. They weren't flying saucers until 1947, and they weren't UFOs until after that. But the characteristics were much the same. And in the United States in 1897, we had several hundred sightings that are documented in the newspapers across the nation. I've gone to newspaper files and pulled the reports of those out and accumulated a number of them just to satisfy myself that it was not a figment of imagination or somebody imbibed a wee bit too much and came up with a wild story, or the Liars Club developed a story or something like that. And I found that there was a number of sightings of objects that are much like the cigar-shaped UFOs seen today, except they appeared to be older technology. They didn't appear to be anti-gravitic necessarily. They appeared to be more like a dirigible type device. They had motors and a humming sound, not necessarily propellers, but nevertheless it didn't sound like the technology we're seeing with UFO reports today.
What it sounds like, let me interrupt here though, when you think about it, is that some Earth-based culture or group of technologists was way ahead of the rest of the pack at that time, and they were moving ahead leaps and bounds, making air dirigibles, electric propulsion. Now perhaps we have a group that none of us know about by name or even see them that have just moved ahead privately.
Well, that would certainly provide answers to a lot of questions. It would get rid of the complaints that people have that we couldn't possibly be visited by extraterrestrials, for instance. And that's a very good line of thought to follow. I like what you said. But let me go back a little bit further into 1897. I have a piece of material that was obtained from a crash site. There was a report of an object crashing in April of 1897 in Texas. This object was spotted traveling across the state of Texas by farmers, people in cities, for several hundred miles. It wasn't a flash in the night like a meteorite. It was something that went chugging along, not literally chugging, but humming along. As it crossed the area, farmers that were going out that morning to milk their cows saw this big, bright, glowing thing flying overhead, proceeding onward. And when it approached a farm lot near Aurora, Texas, which is near Dallas, a major city in the state of Texas, it struck a windlass house being the device that they lower a bucket down into the well and pull up water. And when it struck that house, it exploded into a violent explosion. Not like you would expect from a balloon or something at the time, but with a lot of fire, molten metal, the splitting of the pieces of the craft, and there was one person on board, a small little guy that was killed. Now, I'm giving you this as an anecdotal story. I wasn't there, and I can't prove that it happened. That anecdotal story went into the archives of the newspaper. Many years later, in digging through, looking for those cases, we came across that one. A British film group came to the United States, looked around a bit, and said there was absolutely no evidence that that occurred. They couldn't even find the town where it was supposed to have happened. And we thought, well, that's rather strange, that there must be some pay dirt. Where there's smoke, there's fire, is an old American saying. And so we started looking for the fire that was creating the smoke. And we found that on several farms across Texas, we found families that were the descendants of the people that originally owned the farm. And the people still living there were the children that were alive the day this happened. And then we found 3 adult witnesses that were in about 90 years old, in that range, that were still very alert, very intelligent, very coherent in their descriptions, that told us separately, each one of them, exactly what they said happened. And it was patterned right after the newspaper reports, of course. We had one lady that said, well, you want to know where the little guy is buried? And we said, well, of course. And she told us the cemetery, the location to look in the cemetery, and the kind of stone that would be marking the grave. And in going there with a team, we found the stone. Oh. And it had an engravure in it that looked like someone took a chisel and came up with an oblong device that supposedly was to look like the thing the little guy was flying. The story went that they buried the little man at noon, and they gave him a Christian burial because they didn't know what his religion was. That's just kind of funny. But along with them, they supposedly put a chunk of the metal from his craft because that was his only belongings that they put into his grave with him. We found a treasure hunter in Texas that had very sophisticated gear. He could detect a piece of metal at 4 feet in the ground instead of the normal kind where you find pennies on the beach, you know. And this man then lent his assistance and went over the area looking at the pattern that the people reported where the metal was strewn around. And he found that there were great chunks of metal under the dirt surface against the bedrock. And we had some of those dug up and sent to laboratories and found that the metal was absolutely pure aluminum. No trace elements in it, such as you find in the refining processes of aluminum today. And
in other words, we'd have a hard time making it.
We would have a difficult time making it. That is correct. There were traces of iron in suspension, and in some areas that ran up to an inclusion of iron of about 5%. It's generally impossible to put 5% iron in solution in aluminum. Therefore, we had some evidence then that something strange had happened there. Then we took the equipment to the grave site, the metal detecting equipment, and found that sure enough the same sort of signal that was gained from the iron at the crash site was also gained from the site in the grave. And then asking for permission to exhume the body and take a look and see if this really was a little critter, or if it was just a story, or if it was a John Doe down the street that was buried in the grave, we ran into obstructions.
From who?
The cemetery committee would not allow it to happen. They got a court order to stop it while we tried to get a court order to force it. And they put a guard on the gate. Now recognize this cemetery has a metal fence around it with spikes on top to prevent people from climbing out, I guess. I'm not sure why else. But and they put a guard on the gate with a shotgun and said, don't let any of those UFO hunters into our cemetery. While all this is going on, strange as could be, the marker on the grave disappeared. And this rock was in excess of 150 pounds. Someone didn't just come out and pick it up in their hands and take it home as a souvenir.
So in other words, you think the city officials probably just hid it?
City officials probably got rid of it.
Well, you remember the location, do you? I mean,
we remembered the location. We went back with finally got in the cemetery again, went back with the metal went back with the metal detecting gear to try to verify the exact site several weeks later when we finally got in. And sure enough, they'd done more than just taking the stone. The metal was missing. There was a hole in the ground, and the metal was gone.
But who took it?
Someone core drilled it with a core right down to it, removed the metal, and drove away. And therefore, we could no longer prove that this very strange metal at the crash site was the same as the metal in the grave. The evidence was just destroyed.
Did you just say something about this in the American press a couple weeks ago?
Yes, I did. I did a more or less a technical write-up on the material itself. I didn't say much about the background of what happened to the gravesite and the metal and the problems with the people and all. I mainly put together an article that showed that there was a strange piece of material that I thought merited scientific evaluation. And hopefully to get someone to come forward and say, if I had that piece of metal, this is how I would have made it and this is what I would do with it. And so far that hasn't happened, but it was published in a New York newspaper a week before I came to Australia, so I probably haven't had time to be communicated with.
Don't you find it's a bit of a hard role to have your real-world job there at McDonnell Douglas, at the NASA facility, where you have to think as though there's no cover-up and operate on a normal day-to-day basis with your staff, and then come back and talk like this? Doesn't it put some conflict to you?
It is a difficult role to play. There's no doubt about it. I am happy to say, though, that my fellow workers and the people that work for me more or less accept that I'm going to be a forerunner in this field. I'm going to get out. I'm going to beat the bushes. And they don't put me down for it. They don't always support me either. You know, it's sometimes they pretend like it's not going on. And as far as my company goes, they really just don't want to know about it. Just so that I don't get them involved is fine. But the nice part is, in working around McDonnell Douglas or working around NASA, is that whatever the individual wants to do with his own time, his or her own time, it's their time and they're allowed to do it, and they're not censored for it. And I've got to say that has been that way ever since I've been in the space program. I've been free to go and do the things I want to do. I don't get any help, but I don't get any hindrance either. And I don't have anybody telling me, you can't talk like that if you work here. And I think that's good.
Well, now hold on just a second. Now, yesterday when we were talking, remember that, were those guys that kind of disappeared off the job, were they connected with this 1897 thing, with the analysis?
Yeah, I really can't go into that.
Okay, yeah, that's true, I forgot. Yes, all right. But at any rate, this piece of metal is very important, and there's somebody trying to keep it from coming out.
Well, the metal was originally very important when it compared to something in a grave. They could have verified once and for all. At this point in time, it's just another piece of metal that was obtained from a place on the ground.
And the body is gone there, too?
The body is, who knows where it is now. It's been all grown over by grass and everything else, and you couldn't prove. You would have to literally go in and dig up a whole cemetery, you know, a plot around of maybe 50 graves or something at this point in time. And that's not going to happen. I wouldn't even want to do that. I wouldn't want people to disturb that many graves to look for it. I am concerned that no one originally said, okay, we have a marker, we have an indication in the ground, let's open that grave and look at it, because the scientific value was very high, the potential scientific value. They pull people out of the ground in police investigations 2 or 3 times after they've been buried for a lot less reason than that. And police investigations are important, admittedly, but so are scientific investigations.
Okay. Now, we've talked about the 1897 sighting. Can we talk a bit about the effects of some of the contact cases?
Yes, I think the effects resulting from abductions or just close encounters, either way, are the best evidence we have. And I say that because you can have photographs, radar images, burn circles on the ground, plants that are damaged, and all that. And all you can do is accept it at face value, because there's no way of double checking it. When the human's involved and the human is injured in some way, you have you might say, the eyewitness account of the person that's really harmed. You also have the medical account, the medical event history that goes along with that. Usually when a person is damaged physiologically in a UFO encounter, they require a considerable amount of medical help. And so that's probably the most factual record that you can get. It's better than a police record. Doctors are so darn picky on what they write down, on how they treat people, their worries about them, and whether or not they're going to survive, that it makes a very good historical record. So we have a residue of cases where people have been injured. The injuries ranging from simple paralysis. When I say simple, they're paralyzed while the UFO is in the area. Once it leaves, they're okay, with very little after effect. That particular characteristic is one of the more intriguing, because that gives you some clues as to the type of systems that you're working with. On the other hand, many cases involve more in-depth damage to the individual. Instead of temporary paralysis, it involves quite often burns, eye damage, hair loss, loss of weight, loss of appetite, repeated infections, damage to the heart muscles, things of this nature. And when you have those kind of characteristics, those have to relate to some system of some kind that causes it. So you have circumstantial evidence that you both can have measured information from medical people and anecdotal data from the witness themselves that you can splice together along with the same information from case after case after case. And then you start modeling what happened. I like to use the approach of scenarios. A scenario being a story about how this could have happened, and run a given story from beginning to end. Then look for variations on that story and write other scenarios. And do this to the point that you can't think of any other possibilities. In other words, if a person is burned, the first thing you might ask is, was the person really at the scene? and you could come up with a scenario that says the person really wasn't at the UFO scene. The lady was out with her boyfriend, not her husband, and they got caught, and she got hurt in some way, and so she made up the story that a UFO did it. That's not beyond the imagination. On the other hand, you might write the same scenario that this really happened as she said, but she just didn't understand it because this happened to be a microwave device used by one of the telephone companies or something that caused the effect, and she used her imagination a little bit unconsciously to put together the story that she was injured by a UFO. And you might keep going through scenarios like this until you come to the point that says the scenario that this was an object from outer space. It had some type of system that was malfunctioning or not working in the way we would expect it to work. And the woman happened to be in the area at the wrong time, and she was burned by it. And her account is true that she gave. So then you examine all those scenarios and you find out which ones you can reject based on data. And eventually you come down to one that's pleasing. A number of cases I've had, the pleasing one is that someone else's machine other than ours did it. And that is a startling bit of information when you draw that scenario and then you cannot shoot it down.
When you say some other machine other than ours, would you think that Earth technology is to the point that we could build a flying craft with similar characteristics?
I do think that Earth technology is at least near that point. We're in a pivotal point in space history right now. We're converting the space shuttle from a development tool to a workaday tool. That means that scientific interest has got to turn to other challenges for systems. Who wants to build a bigger shuttle using the same technology, for instance? And the next natural step would be some rather exotic system. If you look at the history of UFO reports, you'll find that many of the characteristics of UFOs are now being exhibited by machines made by men. One of them that brings to mind is quite often someone says, I saw a UFO, it flew over, and a pilot from the plane at the same time reported it, said, I'm observing this object at X thousand feet, etc. The tower says, I'm sorry, but we do not have it on radar. They say, well, those people were imagining, or it was further away than they thought it was, or it was really a satellite, and therefore it was not on radar, or they thought it was Venus, and on and on and on. When in fact, the device may have had the capability of being hidden from radar by virtue of the surface characteristics of it.
How would that work?
I don't know. I am not into that phase of technology, but I do know that UFOs that are very solid things that do solid actions against people and machines quite often are not picked up on radar. That means they have some way of disguising the characteristic. One incident that comes to mind that is frightfully interesting was a case in the southern part of the United States several years ago where the person making the report was operating a radar system, a radar at a certain frequency band. Mm-hmm. A UFO was seen coming in the area. The person then was monitoring, waiting for the UFO to cross the barrier. And they found that the UFO, instead of doing that, it followed the perimeter of the coverage of that radar exactly. The radar operator was very astute. He switched to another band, which quickly overlapped the object and painted it, but very quickly the object went outside of that band and went around.
So it had been able to determine.
So it had been able to determine there was a radar and disguise itself from that radar.
Interesting. Interesting. All right, now, radar basically, the straight line radar works on the fact that you send out an electromagnetic wave and it bounces back off the object and you receive the bounce back.
Right.
So if you had a device that would spray or bend the radar frequency away so that it couldn't come back, by a few degrees you get rid of it, that would make you invisible on radar, wouldn't it?
It would seem so.
That brings to mind the Philadelphia experiment. Are you familiar with that?
I am vaguely familiar with the Philadelphia experiment. Being that took place in, 1943, at the time I was a very small boy, and of course I had no knowledge of events like that at the time. And everything that I have read about it has been something that's been published, say, in the last 10 years. And most of that information I've seen has been anecdotal stories about the case where a ship was made invisible, and transported from one shipyard to another and made visible again in the other shipyard and then transported back. Now you consider a large ocean-going military ship, this seems pretty bizarre. On the other hand, if you can have a UFO that can make itself invisible to radar and at times invisible to people, why can't you maybe move a ship simply by changing the field effect of some kind? And I wish I knew more about that, but it's an area that is outside of the UFO thing, and it's a little outside of the space field, and therefore I really haven't had access to people that are really working it.
You know, about the Philadelphia experiment, the rumor market has it that Townsend Brown, Dr. Thomas Townsend Brown, was the chief advisor to Office of Naval Research on that. Now, what do you know about the mysterious Dr. Brown?
I know very little about Dr. Brown. I think one of the reasons I know very little about him is because I wasn't sure that he was real, and so I never spent much time looking for him.
Why weren't you sure he was real?
Well, you hear so many stories about people that supposedly have great ideas, propulsion techniques, systems, operations, military operations, conspiracy theories, you know, various things. You just can't track them all down. He was one that I didn't have access to, and I accepted him as being an interesting person. I must admit, a number of people that I know in the Mutual UFO Network, for instance, have asked me if I've known of Townsend Brown's work, and I really haven't gotten into it very much at all.
Were you surprised when we showed you photographs of him?
I was extremely surprised and delighted, really.
Yes. We've got that film plus about another 30 minutes over what you saw there, plus the lab notes, about 500 pages.
That is, as far as I'm concerned, a breakthrough when you have lab notes.
Well, we saw his mistakes and his successes.
Sure.
It's interesting because he, after he worked with the Navy, he had a mental breakdown in 1943 to 45. We're not exactly sure when. And he was removed from his top secret clearance and wandered around doing some work here and there for private corporations, ended up in France working for the French government in an aircraft hangar making his first flying discs. He was on the way back from there when the reporter caught him for that, I think it was Inter Avia magazine article in 1956. Then since that time, everybody's been looking for him, and he disappeared. And he disappeared into the United States, into Florida, to Numatilla, Florida. He was found there by Agnew Bonson, an industrialist in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, who's now dead, and by James F. King, because they wanted him. They read that article, and they were a bit more persistent than most people, but they had a stroke of luck. They went to Washington on some other legal matters for the company, and they were talking to a patent attorney there by the name of William Moore. I remember this is back in 1958 or 59. And William Moore just happened to know from legal service of patents or patent notices where Townsend Brown was. Now, Townsend Brown is then picked up by these boys, given a laboratory, and he goes to work building his stuff. After he left them in about 1960, I think it was, he ended up in Hawaii with a company called Energy Resources Group, ERG, trying to get energy from thermal vents and this sort of stuff. But he was still corresponding with the Bonson people, the surviving members of the company that he was working with. As I said, Bonson was killed in a plane crash that he was flying. But the interesting thing since that time is he's been very hard to track down, and we tracked him personally. I tracked him all the way to San Francisco as of 4.5 years ago, into the warehouse where he was working, and talked to people around the place, tradesmen, cleaners, and that kind of stuff. And he was there, because like you, I wasn't certain that the guy existed. And then we found out from a guy that I know that you know, Bill Moore, the author in the States, young Bill Moore, he's in our age group or less, was the only person who knew how to get a hold of Townsend Brown by phone. And of course, we wanted to do an interview and said, get him, and he couldn't do it. He said, I talked to him, and he doesn't want to. He just got out of hospital, an operation or whatever, and he's too weak and doesn't want to do it. Now, from that, and from talking to Bill Moore and to getting him to say a few things later, we did determine that Brown was on Catalina Island off the California coast at that time. We then went over to see James F. King at the Winston-Salem facility, and he told us, yes, he knew Townsend, he corresponded with him intermittently, and that he understood he had been ill lately and in the hospital. So Bill Moore most probably was telling the truth, but it's odd to us that a William Moore patent attorney was the only one able to get a hold of Townsend Brown in 1959 or 58 when the Bonson Company wanted him. And today, the only person that can talk to him is a guy named Bill Moore. We're not sure what his family relationship is with William Moore, if any. Is the only one that can get a hold of Townsend Brown. And not only that, Bill Moore is an outspoken person in the UFO question, supporting the little green men are landing type theories and a few things like that. So we find it rather strange, you see.
That's a strange connection. That's worth following up.
You corresponded, did you, with Professor James E. McDonnell before his death?
Yes, definitely did.
Can you tell us a bit about the circumstances of his investigation, what he was trying to do?
Well, James McDonnell was convinced that UFOs were real, they were extraterrestrial, they were physical vehicles that did things we couldn't do, and he continued beat the bushes proving that, taking cases apart, using scientific expertise to prove the critics were wrong. One of the age-old excuses for UFO sightings has been the temperature inversion bit, where things are refracted off of a temperature layer in the atmosphere and people mistakenly think they're UFOs. Being an atmospheric physicist, James McDonnell was able to destroy that information, literally take it apart, because he would take the information about the atmosphere at 100-foot levels, all the way up as far as you could go, and show there was absolutely no case where an atmospheric inversion could have caused a given UFO incident. And time after time he did that. So he was a Spartan character to be able to step out in the field he was in as a physicist the way he did, working around a university, working with government contracts, and still say these things, you know, this UFO is real. I'm convinced it is real. And whenever we had any case that seemed to have physical evidence, Jim was really interested in it. And that's kind of the way I got in contact with him. I had some situations where we found some thin, wispy material that came down after a UFO sighting, which was commonly referred to as angel hair. And I provided that information to him in the first go-around. And after that, then we started interchanging. And he was a brilliant person. His death, I thought, was untimely and was very unfortunate.
Do you think that his death was...
He committed suicide. It's fairly obvious. They found a gun and they found him dead.
Where did he commit
suicide? In the desert.
He walked out of a hospital room and into the desert barefoot several miles and shot himself.
Yes.
And you still believe it's suicide?
It does seem kind of strange, doesn't it?
Do you think that he was encouraged along these lines by some external group? I mean, was there psychological pressure being put on him?
It would be my opinion that he was helped.
I don't think you probably knew the man, but there was another Dr. Morris K. Jessup who had information on this UFO situation. And Dr. Jessup committed suicide with a pipe stuck in the rear of his car, but at an untimely...
In a very untimely manner. I have a friend that has looked into the Jessup case at length as a layman, not as a UFO investigator, and he does not believe that Jessup committed suicide. Jessup also was a brilliant man. He was ahead of his time. He did a lot of very fanciful things in space sciences. And he claimed to have evidence of the reality of UFOs. In fact, he was supposed to deliver evidence the day that he committed suicide.
What, a folder or something?
A folder of material.
Was it for like extraterrestrials or Earth-made? Do we know anything about what
we don't know because the folder never arrived, and neither did he. When they found his body, the folder was not in existence.
Well, look, you know about this theory we've talked about as far as some group, whether they be extraterrestrial or whoever, possibly modeling human thought on the interaction between our culture and extraterrestrial technology. Do you think it would be impossible or too difficult for us to make space people either hypnotically convince people they've seen little green men to make sure that the reality occurred at the right time in our global situation?
I definitely think that's possible.
Do you yourself feel that this may be extremely probable at the moment?
I think that it is highly possible. I can't say extremely probable. My problem with the particular theory is that I wouldn't be sure that whether space people implanted this information or earthbound people implanted the information in the mind. There's no evidence to say who the culprit is. The only evidence you have is that technology is moving in such a direction that you know you can implant sounds and pictures, visual pictures in the head by varying the frequency of microwave energy.
In other words, I could project visual and sound images into your head with...
If you had the right device, you could project all sorts of things into my head. And it could well make me react in such a way that I would do something untoward to myself, or to think that I had been where I hadn't been, that I'd been abducted by a UFO, or I had taken a ride, or I'd had a medical examination by UFOnauts. Or
You mean they never went any place that possibly, and they would...
It would be quite possible to do that, yes.
So this would explain why some of the people also who've been driving down a road in a car and a UFO comes over and they see it, say they talked to me, but without anything, it just appeared in my head.
That's right.
Fascinating.
And a lot of people say, well, that's psychic communication. But what is psychic communication? If you're given to the fancy that that is real, how does it work? There's been no experimentation done that allows you to measure psychic transmitting of thought. There have been a lot of experiments conducted in closed environments that prove that it does take place. But what is the transmitting characteristic? How is it transmitted? Using some sort of a pulsed energy beam, you could transmit in much the same way, which would be akin to psychic transmittal, but it really, in reality, is a radio transmittal in a way. And you are the receiver.
Fascinating. Okay. The angel hair you spoke of, what was the chemical combination?
It was essentially protein.
Protein. Like hair.
Like hair.
And this came off of the craft itself.
It came down after the craft flew over.
So it could have been, what would that be, nitrogen, hydrogen, an ammonia-based with some carbon in it?
Carbon in it.
So it could have been a compound formed over an industrial area from the carbon particles in the air from...
Certainly.
So it would be a high-temperature chemical reaction with an electric field, which would have probably changed the...
Right. And it doesn't appear that it comes out of a pipe or a hatch or something. It appears in the air after the object goes over, so it would tend to make you think it was an interaction of heat and pollutants or something.
Is it true that when you touch the stuff, it begins to break down?
It does break down and eventually dissolves and then disappears.
What is it, vaporize or absorb?
It appears to, I'm not sure what the mechanism is. In the atmosphere, if you leave it alone, it will be gone in a few hours.
So when you
It's
got
not like a spider web, for instance, that will remain for days even if it's undisturbed.
Did you do any light diffraction tests on
No,
it?
we did not. We didn't keep the stuff around long enough is what happened.
When you say it was a protein base, can you remember the major relationships, like the carbon or hydrogen?
I can't at this point. That has been 15 years ago when I did that work.
Did you keep the stuff at home so we can have it later, or the details?
It all is gone.
No, I mean the details of the analysis.
I have some of the details. I would have to find them. I'm not even sure what they are.
Also, in the various landing spots for suspected UFOs, where they have these round patches or imprints, you were telling me that there is an abnormal percentage of iron in the area where the device has been sitting. Is that correct?
That has been found in several cases, and one that we have very good measured data took place in Kansas in the United States in 1971. And the ring was 4 meters in diameter. The soil was affected for 3/4 of, maybe 1/3 of a meter in depth or less. And the ground characteristics changed such that it would not support plant life. You could not wet the ground, the earth, with water or any other kind of fluid. And the rest of the surrounding soil was just a muddy, mushy mess. This was a sheep lot, and I'm sure you're very familiar with sheep lots in this part of the country. And this was during a rainy period when the ground was thoroughly saturated. So something hovering over the sheep lot dried out the ground very rapidly to a great depth. Did not destroy the surface of the earth, however. After the object left the area, it was beginning to become dark outside, and the ground glowed with phosphorescence. From the direction of the wind downstream of the spot, the trees had a phosphorescent glow about them also, like something was airborne that came out of the ground, went down along the wind, and was deposited on the cold trees. And one then can speculate that heating caused a rapid change in the constituents of the ground, since there were probably a lot of waste materials from the sheep in the ground, and caused a phosphorescent glow, phosphorus essentially, to be driven out of the ground, carried on nitrogen as there was a breakdown of the compounds in the earth. And the only way, again, I keep coming back to it, that you could get that condition that I know of is through microwave energy.
But why would it make the iron level imbalance?
That's another one of the $64 questions. There was an increase in zinc also.
Is zinc, iron and zinc, does zinc have any magnetic properties?
I don't believe so.
Was the concentration a really abnormal amount of zinc?
Well, it was a minute amount, but it was abnormal in the amount of increase. Like a 100-fold increase, but it was still just a tiny amount of zinc.
Was the zinc that was there in some sort of a chemical combination with the iron that it showed up?
I don't believe so. I don't know that, though. We had the soil actually analyzed in a number of university laboratories, none of which could do an adequate job, by the way. They all wanted to take the material apart and say, well, it's got this much of this and this much of that in it. And that was a useless examination. The way we finally got a handle on the problem was to take it to a laboratory that was specializing in growing plants in the desert. And they would tell you what it takes to make something grow in the soil and what is available for plant growth. And that is the sort of analysis then that really revealed a picture of what was wrong with the soil. A
So
very unique way of analyzing.
had something been taken from the soil instead of added?
Apparently there was something taken from it, and that was a conversion of the soluble to insoluble salts due to heating and driving off nitrogen in particular and carrying phosphorus with it.
When you took the soil samples, you took one in the ring and then some, or some in the ring and some out of the ring.
That's correct.
Did you go far enough away to remove the possibility that if this craft were using a very dense direct current magnetic field and heating the ground at the same time, that it might have caused a migration of iron-bearing minerals, magnetic minerals, over to that ring as an electrical process? Did you get far enough out?
Yes, the samples were taken at extreme distances, even to where the boy was standing, and he was outside of the effects area. About the only effects the boy had was sheer fear and a temporary blindness in the eyes due to the brightness of the object. It was interesting, though, that there was a reaction there to the sheep. A number of sheep were in this lot. The boy was a young future farmer of America type. He kept very accurate records on these sheep because they were a project. He knew exactly what they were fed, their weight gain, weight loss, the changing characteristics of them on a daily basis. And after this incident, all of the sheep, when they reached an age several weeks later to become impregnated, gave birth very early with fairly well-developed young, but all dead. There was no live births, and the gestation period was cut in half before they gave birth, which is a very strange situation.
But that would be a hormone change, as some of the women in the Cash-Landrum case may have.
Or in some of the abduction cases.
Yes. Can you give me a bit of a recap on the Cash-Landrum case? What happened and what happened to the witnesses?
Yeah, essentially, the Cash-Landrum case is a situation where a lady, 52 years old, was driving a car. Her friend, 57 years old, also an employee of hers, by the way, was riding in the seat beside her, and the young grandson of the older lady was in the back seat, looking over and riding down the road. They'd been out to dinner and were returning home on a very deserted highway, and they spotted, the little boy actually spotted a very bright light above the trees. And this is a forested area of Texas, very tall pine trees. And the weather was fairly chilly, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And they saw this bright object ahead, and they commented on it. Oh, that's a very strange thing. Maybe it's an airplane. And they went on chatting, as women do quite often when driving down the road with nothing better to do. And first thing they know, this big bright object plopped down out of the sky right in front of them. It was no longer a spot in the sky. It was a big, huge above the road, and then it started shooting flames out the bottom, all the while glowing very heavily. It was a very narrow road. The car was a very large automobile, and they were afraid to go under the thing, so they all stopped. Immediately, the car became heated. They got very, very warm. So they opened the doors and got outside the car where it'd be cooler. And the little boy was terribly frightened. He was screaming and crying and tugging on his grandmother. She stood outside the car for 2 or 3 minutes and finally crawled back in and held the boy. The driver, Mrs. Cash, walked forward of the car and stood looking up at this big bright thing. We later measured the distance, and she was very, very near to it, like 20 times the length of her automobile. And when it did, a large number of helicopters chased it. which was a classic movie chase, and we never did fully explain that. But these people then proceeded on home, and they encountered the object again down the road 2 or 3 times because the road curved in the same direction it was flying. And by the time they reached home, approximately an hour later, they were burning, physically burning. Their skin was singed. They had very bad headaches and felt nauseous, and they simply went home and went to bed. And by 2 or 3 in the morning, they began to vomit. And then a few hours later, they started having diarrhea. And their skin became more and more inflamed and redder and redder and redder, like a person been out in the sun at the beach, and they don't realize how burned they were until several hours later. Several hours later, these people were badly burned. By the next day, the driver that stood outside so long, her eyes were swollen closed. She had big blisters across her eyelids and her forehead, full of water. Those blisters spread into her hair and her head and in her arms. And she went into a comatose state, fairly unconscious. No one would talk to her because it was a holiday. It happened to turn out to be the New Year's holiday, and all doctors were on holiday. And after the holiday was over, they finally got her into a hospital, and they treated her as a burn patient. After 2 or 3 weeks, her hair started falling out. She looked like a classic radiation exposure person. Great hunks of hair fell from her head. And then her skin peeled off in large sections across her forehead and her face. And all the while she had this terrible headache, and she would vomit periodically, and she was losing weight very rapidly. And this went on and on and on. Doctors didn't know what to do. They ran every test they could think of running. They ran CAT scans to see if she might have a brain tumor. Things like that you would normally not run for someone coming in with a burn. And this poor lady was in and out of the hospital in intensive care at least 4 times, and in the hospital for other reasons 3 or 4 more. She still has problems even to this day with sores that swell up on her body and burst. And she hasn't worked since that time. This is a person that was very energetic. She operated a restaurant and a grocery store, both. Single woman. One of those businesses ran 24 hours a day, so she was always on call and always available. Since the incident, she hasn't worked. She's lost most of her businesses. She's had to be cared for like an invalid at times. The other lady has not worked either. Her eyes have been damaged even worse than Mrs. Cash's eyes. She's virtually blind in the left eye. She sees from a narrow cone out the center of the eye now. Just her vision is narrowing continuously like a shutter on a camera. And her hair also partially fell out and then regrew. And she's had terrible sores that came on her body. Little boy had very short exposure time, and his problems have been mainly in weight loss and sickness and the like. This was a very energetic little boy. He, at 7 years old, had his own motorcycle, had won several trophies in ball and bowling and things like that. After this, he was no longer an energetic little boy. He was a sickly child that was unable to eat, unable to keep food down.
Okay.
It was just a bizarre case. So you have a lot of characteristics, all of which are exposure to radiation.
What frequencies?
And it appears that there's a very broad band spectrum of radiation here. You can see the conditions of ultraviolet, for instance, on the skin effects. You can see maybe even a light X-ray in the loss of the hair, or perhaps a heavy dose of microwave mixed in with it all, causing a bunch of the problems. The driver that spent so much time outside also started having infection of the heart sac, which is generally accepted as a result of being exposed to microwave energy.
This is the cardiomyopathy you were talking about.
Cardiomyopathy.
John, I've showed you while you've been here some of the work we've been doing here on duplicating flying saucer technology. And I've shown you the Lorentz force drive and the concept of the recycling hot nitrogen plasma. In your opinion, is that if not an engineering model, is that a workable theory for performing the kind of things that UFOs do?
In my opinion, it's a real good starting place for us humans to do what UFOs are doing. Yes.
So in other words, if we don't have these flying saucers now, with what we've got here on the drawing board, and finance, we could probably build one.
Why not? It would appear to me that you have all of the basics necessary to do that. You've demonstrated the theory, You've not only done it on paper, but you have it in actual laboratory demonstration. That's always a starting place for any new project. And that's been proven as very successful from what I can see. Therefore, why not proceed to the next step and try to turn it into operable hardware? See, the problem that I've had in the past with this has been that all the people I've talked to had the theory on paper, but they could not get past certain roadblocks in present scientific thinking that says this is impossible. Therefore, they never carried it further. They never did the laboratory work. And then they never became brave enough to say, okay, I'm going to take it the next step and really go into the development of the full-fledged thing. And I find it very heartening that you're doing that. It's exciting.
Yes, we find it that way.
Ooh, it's really exciting.
We are a bit concerned with the health of our staff. Already we've suffered some of the minor damage to the body with the radiation, the electromagnetic radiation. Nerves, muscle tissue, mainly some joints in the feet, quite painful. But that's the price of research, isn't it?
It's the price of research, but it also is a bit of evidence that you're getting similar effects to what we're seeing with UFO cases. And the neat part of that is the UFO cases are in the field and you're in the laboratory. Two different environments, same effect.
Yes, yes.
It's unique.
Could you relate to us the little experiment you've been doing with your engineering staff back at Houston?
Yeah, that is a very interesting situation. You hear from so many engineers and scientists that they don't believe in UFOs, they don't read magazines and the like that carry that kind of information and all. Well, I do. I read everything from the most sophisticated scientific journals to the crummiest tabloid newspapers and see what I can find in all of them. And I've been running an experiment for 4 to 6 months now, whereby at work at my office, I have a table that's outside of my main office in my secretary's area where I place my scientific publications that I receive through the mail and the like so other people can share them and see what's going on. I've been placing a stack of the tabloid newspapers also on that table. Each week I'll bring in 2 or 3 tabloids and leave it there. When I'm in my office, no one will touch them. They lay there completely untouched. If I go to a meeting, I'm away from the office for an hour, 2 or 3 hours, engineers filter in, sit down, read those tabloids, cover to cover, look for UFO cases, look for other things, and then put them down and go on their way. If I return while they're doing it, they'll slam them down and say, what is this kind of material doing there? Then if I check with my secretary, I say, how long has that person been there reading this kind of material? And say, oh, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, or whatever. So people just don't like to admit they're doing it, and I think that is so silly, but it's been an interesting experiment.
Also, you have talked to a lot of airline pilots and crews in the States. It's very hard to get them to talk openly, even in private circles, about their sightings. Can you tell us a bit about them, please?
Well, it's not difficult in the States to get them to talk in private circles, but to talk publicly and openly, it's almost impossible now. But in the mid-'60s, I first became interested in UFOs because of working in the space program, and I felt I could actually provide an answer that would debunk these sightings and say, these people are crazy, and this is ridiculous, and in engineering terms, this is what's going on. And I spent 2 or 3 months examining the literature and becoming intrigued by it, but saying, this guy probably wrote that, made it all up, etc. And then we had a UFO incident take place in the St. Louis, Missouri area where I happened to be living at the time, and it involved an airline pilot and his crew, co-pilot, stewardesses, and some people on the plane. This pilot was piloting a commercial airliner for a small feeder airline in the United States, and after takeoff from a small airport out in the central part of the state, he was requested by the Kansas City, Missouri control tower, the Federal Aviation Administration, to investigate a light to the north of his course in the sky. They said that the radar had picked it up. They could tell him the altitude and approximate distance. They had visual sightings on the ground from the weather stations in the area. And would he please divert his flight path, and go take a look? And he did just that. And when he took a look at it, he said, this is a very bright light. It appears to me it's about so many kilometers ahead. And the tower came back and said, you're absolutely right. That's where we read it. It is absolutely stationary now. Would you describe the color of it, please? And he described the color and the pulsation, and he flew on toward it, and he maneuvered his plane in some turns to make sure he didn't have reflections in his windscreen. He called the stewardess to the cockpit and said, "Tell me what you see," you know. And she described with this funny-looking light and got very panicky and went back to the cabin and called somebody else up, and they did the same thing. And they were drawing closer and closer and closing on this object. And so the pilot got the bright idea that he would pick up a very bright handheld light that he had in the cockpit called an Altus light. And he flashed that light on the object, and instantaneously after flashing the light on it, the tower in Kansas City, Missouri, some 250 miles away, said, "The object is starting to move," and they gave him the direction and the approximate speed as it was starting up, and he verified it visually. It flew away some distance and stopped again, and he flew up and flashed the light again. Then it took off at a very high speed and disappeared out of sight over the horizon. He then continued his flight path on into Kansas City, Missouri, checked in his airliner, released the crew, went over to the control tower and asked for permission to see the radar operator and talked to him about this strange light that they were vectoring him in on. And they said, "We don't know what you're talking about. We weren't even operating radar tonight out of Kansas City." And he just was completely irate. He said, "You mean I possibly endangered the people on this airliner after being requested to do it, and you're telling me now nothing happened?" And he became very vocal, and that's how we got involved, and we interviewed him and taped everything and investigated him and his background to see if he had a tendency to make up stories, and we found he didn't, and we found the rest of the crew was very stable, and that turned me around completely. No longer was I intent on debunking it. Then I said, you know, this is an airline pilot that is very aware of what's going on in the skies. His report is logical, and it's verified by all these other people, and no longer can I say that UFOs don't exist. There is something up there. And after that, I became involved with some private organizations and then became a field investigator and a researcher and a collector of information, and I've been doing that ever since. And I've amassed a tremendous amount of information, data, reports, stories, photographs, records, materials, and I am convinced there is something going on. In my mind, there's no room for doubt. The only problem is I don't know what it is yet, and modeling it is my desire. The technology involved is what I love.
What if we find out that it is a cover-up, and it's being done to set up this new world government? What if we find that out? Is what we're doing right or wrong? Should we expose it or not?
That's a difficult thing to say, but if it's in the form of setting up a new world government, that is, one would have to describe what that means.
Well,
what is a new world government? You know, what are the purposes? I couldn't subscribe to any thing as being right or wrong unless I knew a lot more about it than that. I understand what you're saying, but what I'm saying is I'd be very cautious in either saying I'm going to expose or not going to expose. My involvement in the UFO picture is technology. I've been very open about my investigation since the very first days. I converse freely with my friends, with others around the world, people that want to communicate on the subject. And nobody has told me, quit doing that. Nobody has said, shut up. Nobody has censored me. And that's puzzling to me because I know other people that claim to have been censored quite drastically. But I am in love with the technology, and I would pursue it. And if it was being put to a good end, I would support it.
Well, if you were approached from this point forward by someone that said, look, John, okay, you've been down to see that character down there in Australia, that Deyo bloke, and he's let too much slip to you. You know how to work him now, and you realize that we're up to something. But here's what it is, and we'll let you have the technology and let you work with us. If you just understand what we're doing, come with us and drop out. Would you be tempted?
I'm sure I would be tempted. I would admit it, I would be tempted.
At that point, then you would
But I
have
want to know
choice.
who that somebody was. I'm a very loyal American, and you've got to know that from the start of things. I'm sure that you feel the same way about Australia now since you've been here so long. And I wouldn't do anything to hurt the country, you know, the goals of the country or anything else. And if this was something outside of our nation that seemed like it was detrimental, I would be very cautious about going with it, even with the technology. I like working in the space program, for instance, and if it was counter to the good of the country, they would probably run me out of the business, and I wouldn't want that to happen. I admit that quite freely. I wouldn't want that to happen.
So based on that then, there could be a point in our investigation of this cover-up where it would be a personal choice on your behalf or possibly even mine that you'd say, well, I'm not going to say anymore.
That's true.
In fact, you have to ask yourself, why are you saying it to anybody now?
Oh, I know why I'm saying it now.
Why?
I'm saying it now because the only way that you can go anywhere with it is to share and to work with others. If you just have the information and take it around inside yourself, it's like running around a racetrack. You never get anywhere. And with technology, you can't go around a racetrack. You've got to get outside the loop, and you've got to extrapolate it and take it somewhere. And the only way you can do that is to interchange ideas with other people. The only way you can gain UFO data and information is to be vocal. So someone knows you're there and wants to give you the information. And that's the main reason that I speak about it. It'd be much easier to work in the laboratory and not go out in the field and not lecture and not investigate reports and not assist people that become burned and hurt. But then I would have the complete flow of information cut off if I didn't do that. And so I feel driven to do it for that reason.
Okay.
There are various ways to raise money to do research. If there appears to be a technology involved that can be used commercially, someone will fund it. If it's a little more esoteric than that, you can usually find some individual that's interested enough that they will put some money into it. But more than often than not, the people finance their own way in these invisible college groups. Each one pays their own way as they go.
The Club of Rome intrigues me because I've interviewed Dr. Pache before,
Mm-hmm.
and he says that they directly or indirectly advise 96 world government organizations, like world leaders and countries.
Oh, sure.
How do they advise them like that? I mean, was it a piece of paper, a phone call, say, do this, do that, don't do, or what?
I think it's probably all of the above. You know, quite often I'm sure that someone calls and says, what are the statistics on this, the demographics of a given area, and what's going to result from it? And they say, well, in our studies it shows that these things will happen about this period of time if this doesn't happen. Give you a quick phone call and do it. But they also publish a lot of reports. You know, there have been several major books published on the results of the studies of the Club of Rome. Those are the kind of official things. They also hold yearly symposia, and they present papers. One year it may be on communications, another year on some other phase of it. But there are vast numbers of papers presented, and those then form a database that can be used to advise people with. And that's whether or not you want to accept the advice, but if you pay for it, you'll probably accept it.
Well, now, in the Club of Rome model, because of the parameters they set on their macroeconomic model,
Mm-hmm.
they've divided the world up into 10 socioeconomic regions, like a new states or whatever.
Right.
Does the Herman Kahn model do that same thing? Do they?
No, the Herman Kahn model doesn't divide it up the same way. The Herman Kahn model looks at various, what he called drivers of the future, and I can't recollect all those at the moment, but they're a lot more directly involved with what makes things happen than regions of the country or specific characteristics. He looks at the parts of the world that will become the real leaders and say, you know, who has the highest per capita income and who has the greatest growth rate and who has the potential for that. And you soon find out that the United States and Japan are both ranking up there very highly in this gross national product range. Japan rapidly overtaking Russia, for instance, in that realm. And third world countries playing into it a lot by virtue of how they're going to change based on their economic standards changing and the style of life and the malnutrition disappearing and those sorts of things. So Kahn doesn't argue on the same set of statistics as does Meadows and the Club of Rome, but it still gets to the same end point. Kahn is not a statistician. The Club of Rome works really as more of a statistical study. If you use these parameters, what results? And the unfortunate part is that I don't think they use the right set of parameters. You can vary their parameters 5% and change the whole world outcome.
In other words, it looks a lot better if
you can, just by changing one variable, you make the whole world look much better.
Well, don't you think?
One more thing they ignored completely was the possibility of extraterrestrial intervention in this future. It's not even considered in either the Kahn or the Meadows camp, which is surprising. There's no mention made of it.
You think that they should seriously
I think they
investigate
should
that?
at least have rejected it in their studies. With the total absence of it makes you think they may accept it and are ignoring it, choosing to ignore it.
Fascinating. Yes.
People this aware of human nature and the sociological conditions around the world have to be highly aware of the number of UFO sightings and how that affects people's and their feelings.
And not only that, you have to be aware of how pre-Hitler Germany suddenly switched on to a focal point leader.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a world circumstance the same now. So if we had a central figure that was a human being type, or not a Russian or an American or whatever, but a neutral, which would be an extra human culture person, whether they came from under the ocean or in orbit, if you had this kind of a person with super technology, you could probably pull it off, couldn't you?
I think you probably could.
Don't you think really that the E.T. and Encounters movie and the Star Wars type thing are really leading us toward accepting and looking forward to someone to solve our problems that way?
Well, definitely. That's the key thing. But many of the UFO sighting groups that have been more in the cult category have done exactly the same thing. They have looked for someone out there to solve their problems, and they firmly believe they're going to be solved from out there. And that's nothing new in that camp.
No, it's I've been amazed by the number of people that 5 years ago who wouldn't even entertain you in their office if you mentioned the word UFO. Now, will like a closet drinker almost come out and say, you know, my aunt's seen one. I've got a photo
That's
from
right.
Granny's farm, and these are executives that they'll knock off a board meeting to talk about flying saucers.
Now, what can you tell me today?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Well, I get that all the time.
Fascinating. John, thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the discussion.